Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome. I'm Alexandra. I'm the leader and creative director of City of London Symphonia. And today I'm absolutely thrilled to be talking to the wonderful Brett Dean. Brett, thank you very much for joining me and giving up your time. I really appreciate it.
Alex, that's my pleasure. Thanks.
Now, I was trying to think how to describe you, Brett, because you're so fantastic at many facets of music. You're a composer, performer, conductor, director, curator of programs, festivals. Traditionally a musician in this kind of old sense of the word probably was all those things. I mean, when we look back to sort of 18th and early 19th century, do you really see yourself as all of those all of the time? Or does it sort of ebb and flow depending on what projects you've got coming up, or indeed sort of through the path of your career, maybe one has predominated?
Yeah, well, it does go through different phases. I mean, the composing part came relatively late. I was a late starter as far as composing is concerned. So I really only got into it in my 30s. And my first big orchestral piece premiered when I was in my mid-30s, for example. And yeah, so up until that point, obviously performing had been the main thing. Conducting too came much, much later, although I studied conducting when I was at college in Australia. And my viola teacher, a wonderful man called John Curro, who sadly just passed away only about half a year ago, he was also my conducting mentor and gave me my first couple of opportunities to conduct ensembles and small orchestras while I was still a student in Brisbane. But then it didn't really sort of kick in as another aspect of what I do until, I was invited then regularly to conduct my own works, first and foremost, and then from there it sort of branched out. But as far as I'd have to say, I think probably composing, well, it's certainly the thing that occupies my mind most of the day, or at least most of the time. At the same time, I couldn't imagine only composing and never actually being part of the performing aspect. I think that the two feed off one another, whether that's then playing viola as a performer or conducting with an orchestra, but that connection with musicians, the live aspect, the sort of continual remembering what that's like to not only to write pieces, but to bring them to life, be that my own music or other people's music, that's a fundamental part of it.
If you came to composing fairly late, was there a catalyst for that when you sort of took the plunge and started to write, or had you been writing all along but it was just something that you didn't publish as such? I mean, how did it happen?
I had early ambitions while I was still studying, and I was very interested in new music, and some of my closest friends at college were in fact composers. And so I was forever sort of trying out pieces on their behalf and getting them to write me things. So I was fascinated by the stuff of it, by the process of it. But at the same time, there was this kind of strange specialization type of mentality, I guess, which I think we're starting to break out of now. But at the time, and this was, sort of 80s, 90s, composers compose and performers perform, and never the twain shall meet. And, there was this sort of... So looking back prior to that period, there, as you hinted at earlier too, I think composers were performing musicians, more or less, and there wasn't this sort of, this division. And so, I think somehow I really wanted to break through that. But I got into composing, in fact, quite unexpectedly, despite a really sort of classical music upbringing and education. It was actually through a rock musician and improviser that I got into it. And we started jamming and playing around with ideas in little, often very lo-fi, simple recording studios, or often just with a reel-to-reel machine in a spare room somewhere, and started putting together music for experimental films. And that got bit by bit a bit more sophisticated, and occasionally we'd get the opportunity to work in proper radio studios, and that sort of developed. This started, I guess, the late 80s, 88 or so would have been where it started. The friend's name that got me into it is Simon Hunt. He was an Australian as well in Berlin, as I was then. And he'd travelled to Berlin as a member of a rock band from Sydney who were trying their luck and hoping to get a recording contract and all that sort of, ambitious take on the world type of thing, which ultimately for that band didn't happen. But perhaps for us individually, for Simon and then for myself, that was perhaps a good thing, because what we ended up doing together we enjoyed greatly. And in a way, the irony was, I was in the Berlin Philharmonic by that stage. I was in the viola section. I had been for some years, and I was enjoying it immensely and learning a lot and learning repertoire and so on. But there was an aspect of it that I found quite constricting and quite conservative, and, it was top button done up. And, in those days also quite a few of the older colleagues still turned up to rehearsals in suit and tie, and it was really quite old school and a different world. And so I was aware of this sort of tightness of it, and at the same time, Simon with his band found that there was a kind of similar limitation to being in a rock band. It had its kind of formulaic way of doing songs, and the chords were often the same, and he in the band was the one that was responsible for the interesting sound. He was kind of the one that had a stripped back upright piano that he bashed the crap out of with hammers and things. And so there was on both sides of the equation there was this desire to sort of break out of mold that we felt somewhat limited by. And so we started improvising, also doing live performances, and we did a couple of recordings for a very bizarre Belgian label that did sort of jazz and improv music called Sub Rosa, and they took us on, and it was quite, they were heady days. It was incredibly exciting, and I'd play concerts with the Philharmonic on Friday, Saturday nights, and Saturday invariably we'd then go and play somewhere live late at night after the Philharmonic concert. So I'd play a Bruckner or a Mahler symphony at 8 p.m. and then dash over to the deepest, darkest corners of Kreuzberg and put on the black leather jacket and play improv gigs until early in the morning. And it was just incredibly inspiring, and there was this strange pressure cooker atmosphere of West Berlin in those days, and ironically, or perhaps not surprisingly, some of these clubs that we played at were right up against the wall. They were the last bastions of free thought in the Western system, and on the other side of the wall was dark, stringent socialism and a sort of joyless regime that we also, my wife and I, got to know sort of from the inside, because we helped the family. We got to know a family, a ballet dancer and her husband and child, and they became very good friends of ours. We'd visit them quite regularly and ultimately helped them escape from East Germany not long before the wall came down. So, it was just an incredibly inspiring time. And, stuff was happening, not only then in my own personal and professional life, but also politically and socially. So, it was an incredible time to be in Berlin too. And I feel privileged to have seen Berlin, for quite a few years before the wall came down. because it sort of puts it into context. And so all of this fed into this burgeoning desire to make up my own stuff, really.
Wow, I love the idea of the Berlin Phil alongside a rock band being quite similar in some ways. I've never heard that those two equated in that way before, but I know what you mean exactly.
Yeah, they have their structures and they have their sort of their directions that they find difficult to break out of.
Or expectations, I suppose. Yeah.
Expectations are also expectations from their audiences too.
Exactly.
The audiences also are part of that equation. They go along to either their concert hall or to their venue with very particular things in mind that they want to get out of that evening, and they don't like questions being asked or those expectations being put into doubt, I suppose. And I then had to sort of appreciate and understand that I had some of those sort of preconceived ideas myself, just from having had such a background in classical music. I've been playing in youth orchestras since I was 10 or something. And so, it was, and it's a world that I still love, but I am also aware of its limitations or its shortcomings, or where it needs to sort of just get out of it and have fun.
Sort of thinking about expectations or sort of our conception of how a concert might be. We, of course, were very lucky to work with you at City of London Sinfonia. It was a little over 2 years ago, I think it was now. A fantastic concert about Beethoven and his sort of very sad, gradual loss of hearing. And if I can work backwards in the concert, in the second half, we performed his Eroica Symphony, which you directed from the viola. Now, I always love it when you can play a symphony directed from an instrument, like chamber music. I think people listen in a different way. I think there's a spontaneity about the performance, but it is quite unusual. It shouldn't be perhaps, but it is quite unusual to be directed from the viola. To me, it made sense with that piece because there's such visceral energy, and it's kind of like the engine room in a way. It helps to drive things forward. It worked. But I wonder whether that's something you do more and more, or does it depend on the repertoire that you're dealing with? And do some pieces presumably work better like that than others?
In some ways, all of those things come into consideration. And the Eroica was the first sort of bigger symphonic piece that I'd ever led from the viola. I've done some other things since, but mostly smaller things. But very much, as you say, it's because of this drive that comes from the inner voices that makes it possible to start with, I think. I think, obviously, really the only instruments in the orchestra from which you can lead an orchestra would be either the violins, arguably also the second violins. Why not? I mean, if the seconds were, if there was a principal second violinist who had the concept and so on, I don't see why that can't happen. And similarly, viola, and also in the way that we did it, that the violas were standing. First of all the violins and violas are standing. It sort of liberates the sense of physicality that you need, and also standing on the outside of the orchestra, so you have everyone's attention, but also that you can see everyone as well. I guess a principal cellist could do it from a similar situation, but being seated, it's perhaps not as easy. But I mean, certainly it was a great experience. I've done the Eroica now several times, but that was the first time with the City of London Sinfonia that I was able to put it into that program with Christopher Clark, and sort of develop this new kind of I don't know, it was kind of like a long TED talk in some ways, wasn't it? But it's also it teaches you quite a lot about the piece. And of course, Beethoven symphonies were arguably among the first pieces that were then conducted in the way that we know today, and arguably many of those pieces were also probably not conducted at their first performance. The first two symphonies almost certainly sort of directed by Beethoven, probably from a keyboard. And so, you know, it was that time was the emergence of the maestro standing at the front of the orchestra. And in many ways, the advent and development of concert series, of concert halls, of designated venues, the burgeoning sort of middle class that had money, disposable income, and a certain level of education that allowed music to become this kind of thing that you sit and listen to, rather than it being a function of a court or of a church, you know. And so, you know, it's very much at the cusp of all of those different tendencies and developments in music's history that it sort of lends itself to taking hold of in that way, in that very direct way, and leading from one of the instruments. Of course, also the wind players have incredibly important roles to play as well. And one thinks particularly in the Eroica of the principal oboe part, but that's also a role that would be difficult to lead the orchestra from, because you're kind of behind the string players. At the same time, whilst, you know, I was thrilled and am always thrilled to take on that extra responsibility, it doesn't work without, as you know, as leader of the orchestra on that occasion too, it doesn't work without the leadership and participation and active chamber music-like involvement of not only the principal players, but basically everybody.
Yeah.
And that's what's so exciting about it. You cut through this tendency, again, coming back to the drawbacks of the orchestral model, is that it can become uninspiring for some of the players, and the guy up the front is going to tell us what to do and we just have to do it kind of thing. That sort of model is always problematic, and it cuts through that immediately. You have this different sense of participation. Personally, also in the way that I like to go about that, I like getting feedback from other players, even if sometimes that means, you know, that you'll have arguments about how it should go and what decisions you've made, as opposed to, you know, thoughts that other members of the orchestra might have. And you have to put that out there. You are then more open to that kind of input. But ultimately, I find that speaks to musicians in orchestras too. They like that sense of being asked what their feelings are. And yeah, I have, you know, very fond memories of that whole project. Yeah,
it was lovely. And then in the first half of the concert, of course, we performed Testament, one of your fabulous pieces. But you did conduct that. I personally love it when a composer conducts his or her work, because as long as they're quite good at conducting, which of course you are very good at conducting, because then they know what to listen for, they know what they want from a piece, and you feel, you know, if they're pleased, then you must be close to what they were imagining. How is it from your side of the baton, as it were? Because I've also got composer friends who find hearing their music almost torturous sometimes, but maybe it's good to have the power over the creative process in the concert, as it were. I don't know. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, for me, it definitely falls into two categories. A piece like Testament that has been played a lot, that I didn't actually conduct the first performances of, although in its earlier version, which originally the piece was written for a group of 12 violas, and I premiered it with my former colleagues of the Philharmonic viola section. I'd left the orchestra by then, but I was one of the 10 players. And another viola colleague, Henrik Schaefer, who's since left the orchestra and has a very successful career, above all in Scandinavia, as a conductor. He conducted the performance. And I must say, then I'm very glad to let someone else sort of sort out the nitty-gritty of how the piece works. Best of all is actually also that I'm out in the hall listening to the rehearsals, because then I find I can judge it more objectively, have a little bit of distance from it, and not be sort of also caught up in the perhaps technical difficulties of conducting. I was once in a position where I went to Amsterdam to be present for rehearsals of the world premiere of my violin concerto, and with Frank Peter Zimmermann as soloist and the Concertgebouw Orchestra of Amsterdam. And on the second day of rehearsals, the conductor had to return home because of family illness, and I had to then jump in and conduct my own piece, which was frightfully hard. And I hadn't really sort of sat down and worked out how to approach it as a conductor. I was, you know, and so that was, you know, a baptism of fire, but it was a great thrill. They're a fabulous orchestra, of course, and they, you know, they were incredibly supportive because they were also aware of the challenge of the situation. But yeah, so I much prefer first performances at least to be sitting outside of the, beyond the fourth wall, as it were. But then I love, once the, you know, the ice has been broken and I know how the piece goes from the outside, I love being part of that process. And Testament is a case in point, a piece that I've conducted a lot and recorded once as well. And you know, it's a thrill to be able to tease out the sounds just as you want them.
Talking of the sounds in that piece, you had quite specific requirements, but I think was all the string players had to play with rosinless bows, so it basically doesn't really make any sound. Obviously, sort of alluding to Beethoven's Gradual Deafness, I believe. How did you discover that? And then including it, because it became very much a sound world. It wasn't an effect. It became part of the sound world of the piece. How did you then build it into the kind of compositional process?
So as I said, the first version of the piece was for 12 violas. And so, in fact, then in that version, every single musician that's playing the piece has, you know, these two bows. I came across the sound quite by accident, in a way, in that I left my bow with my regular violin maker in Berlin, and for a rehair, I went to pick it up, and normally he puts a first kind of layer of rosin onto the bow before I pick it up, because, as you know, it takes quite a while and quite a bit of, you know, rubbing the rosin into the hairs of the bow to get a first basic layer that sort of sits and stays there. And I got home, I needed to get some practice done, took the newly rehaired bow out of my case, started playing, and then thought, oh, he's not put some rosin, hasn't put any rosin on it yet. And in fact, my first reaction was a bit one of annoyance, because it takes, as I say, it takes a while, and I just needed to get some work done. But then I just started playing around with it and thought, this is quite remarkable, and this is exactly the sound I was looking for. And to be honest, the first sort of metaphor that came to mind wasn't so much the one of the you know, not being able to hear the sounds clearly, but of the image of Beethoven's quill on the parchment paper, either writing music, or in the case of his Untitled Testament, the document that he wrote from this institution, where he went to try and find a solution to his multiple health problems, the most alarming of which was the loss of hearing. And this is where he wrote this letter. I mean, it was intended as a last will and testament, because he had seriously toyed with the idea of suicide and was at such a point of despair. And he wrote this letter then to his brothers, but he never sent it. It was only discovered after his death among his papers. And it's by Beethoven's sort of standards of handwriting, it's actually quite legible. And he obviously put quite a bit of time into it. He'd probably written a rough version and then wrote it out neat, as it were, and compared also to his sketchbooks, where there's a combination of also written words and music notation. Some of it is just done so quickly that it's really hard to decipher. I sometimes even wonder, when he came back to these things after several weeks or months to sort of work on the pieces in detail, how on earth he even remembered what. I know I find it difficult when I'm writing things down quickly. I come back to it later and think, what was it I meant with this scribble in front of me? But so it was actually, that was the metaphor that came to mind first. But then I realized later, oh, it has this other side to it. You know, it has this sort of ill-defined haziness, which seemed somehow to also speak to the dilemma that he was going through with his own health.
Yeah. One aspect of your career, I suppose, that we didn't get to appreciate as such in our last concert with you, was your sort of solo and chamber work. And obviously, you've probably been asked this many, many times, but it is fascinating to me that you were in the Berlin Philharmonic. And it's hard enough, I think, for a musician to leave an orchestra and then continue a freelance career playing in an orchestra. That's quite a big step. But to leave an institution like the Berlin Phil and then sort of launch, in a way, this incredible career of composing and performing solos and chamber music. First of all, it must have been, was it a tough decision? And also, how easy was that transition afterwards? Were there sort of shocks along the way, or did it sort of just evolve naturally?
It certainly wasn't an easy decision to make. No, it took quite a long time. And I was toying with the idea for quite some time before, again, sort of writing an important letter, sitting down. Like Beethoven, I did a couple of trial runs of that letter of resignation too when it came to it. But I was also, I must say, encouraged hugely by my wife Heather, who's also a freelance artist herself. She's a painter, and so she was pivotal in this sort of transition from performing musician to composer and creative musician, because she was the creative type. And I guess also there was always this kind of envy and admiration, but also envy for that life that she was leading. And she was only too encouraging to sort of help along that path in the discussions we had about it. Yeah, so it took, as I say, quite a while to get my head around it. I also needed to feel that I had enough sort of commissioned work coming up, that I wasn't, I mean, we had 2 young children by that time too, so I couldn't just abandon my responsibilities as a family father. And so it took a while. It then was also, once I had left the orchestra, and we then also returned to Australia at that time, it was an opportunity for us from a family and private point of view to offer our children a chance to experience life in Australia, to really get to know the rest of the family, their grandparents, etc. So it had multiple aspects to it. But I would admit also in that first year, there were times where I thought, what have I done? I'd left this sort of family of colleagues and this kind of support group that one has around one behind. And I must say also, they were great colleagues. In that time that I was obviously getting more and more interested in composition, I had nothing but support from so many of them, including directly also my colleagues in the viola section who, were incredibly supportive. They were curious. Other colleagues would also help out, particularly wind and brass players, if I had questions about their instruments, which of course I wasn't as familiar with from a playing point of view. I got all the insider tips, as it were, from some of the greatest instrumentalists around. And it was very fortuitous in that regard. And so, there was this shock, obviously, of that all not being there all of a sudden. It may have been different had I left the orchestra but remained in Berlin, perhaps, but it was the time for a change. Mm-hmm. And as we were talking about before we started the formal part of the conversation, this is a time also of massive change for a lot of people, and for my wife and myself as well. This is going to be a time of change, of sort of perhaps moving out into the country and leaving the city for a while, and working out how on earth we all make a living in a post-COVID world. But anyway, that's for another time to work out and worry about. But so yeah, I mean, it had all sorts of aspects of a pivotal shift, and yeah, I then, after that initial shock, the first year was not always easy. Then after that I kind of embraced it entirely, and have never regretted it.
Mm. Brett, it's been a pleasure and an inspiration to talk to you today. Thank you very, very much, and thank you for giving up your time. And
my pleasure.
And I know we're trying to, post-COVID allowing, we're trying to make sure that you can come back and collaborate at CLS again. So I look forward to that very much.
I do too, and looking forward hugely to just performing again. It's already been too long, hasn't it?
It has indeed, with other people.
Yeah. Very best wishes to you too, Alex.
Thank you very much.
Much.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.